Basically, the idea is that, well, especially in North America, pacifists and nonviolent advocates have had a very defining role and even a censoring role in determining what other people's participation can be in a whole range of social struggles, and that the way that they've affected social struggles has made it very much easier for the state to control those social struggles. That nonviolence plays a function of recuperating social struggles, of taking out their teeth, making them harmless, so that they can just exist in this sort of cesspool of democratic plurality, in which everything is okay, nothing can really be challenged or changed, and ideas, opinions can be expressed infinitely without ever having any real impact, without really translating into action. A lot of times people will justify nonviolence, making the very common sense, very simple and ultimately false argument that violence is the government's strong suit, and it makes no sense to fight the violence of the government with violence of our own. And what they're doing is conflating very, very different activities. They're suggesting that somehow defending yourself against police violence, or destroying commodities, or taking over property, fighting to free prisoners, indigenous people fighting to take over stolen land, things of this nature, somehow has any similarities with governments carpet bombing villages, or using landmines, or police torturing people, or putting someone in prison. That just because by some linguistic coincidence these different things can be described as violence, that somehow there's not only similarities between them, but that they're the same thing, and that one is going to reproduce the other. When in fact, by fighting back, people actually raise the stakes of repression and oppression for the state, and actually make real short-term differences, and I think also have a greater potentiality of ultimately destroying the state and capitalism, and helping us create those worlds that we want. I think it's because the left, to a large extent subconsciously, has as its primary role to make resistance harmless. States have recognized that resistance will never disappear, that struggles will never disappear, and in the past they tried suppressing struggles the first time that they show their heads, if there's any sign of them, and that proved ineffective. So nowadays the way that states rule is by accepting the inevitability of conflict and resistance, and just trying to manage it permanently. And the best way to manage it is to also have people in the resistance who are managing it for you. And that's really the role that nonviolence plays, and it's really encouraged by the media, by various dominant political discourses, that the state is allowed to use violence, but people who are rebelling, people who are angry, people who are trying to attack the system are aggressively isolated, slandered, bad-mouthed, punished if they ever use violent tactics.
From the burned-out shell of an Ottawa bank in a quiet family neighborhood come loud cries of condemnation against the self-proclaimed anarchists who blew it up. If blowing up this bank is advance notice or a way to boost the ranks of a murky anti-globalization movement, it may have backfired.
There's been a wave of criticism coming from even other special interest groups.
On the same website, other activists call the firebombers everything from idiots to domestic terrorists who've crossed the line. Too radical.
The mass of protesters in Canada don't support violent activity to start with, but there will be a minority that sees this as an inspirational message in order to carry out further violent acts.
And so in this way, the state and the media train, especially more professionally minded activists within the resistance, to enforce this code of nonviolence, so that they never incur that loss in popularity or that bad press. And this creates a self-policing function and people who are the sort of politicians of the movement are more susceptible to it, because they're thinking often in terms of their own careers. The revolutionary anti-racist action in the Netherlands. So we're talking about a very bourgeois and democratic society, a wealthy society, and also this was a group that was active in the 80s, so relatively recently, the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, and they participated in a broader movement against Shell Oil Company, specifically demanding divestment from South Africa. So this is part of larger anti-capitalist struggles and anti-racist struggles that had along their path certain goals that they wanted to achieve. Certain things that they were fighting for more immediately, and so this group, Revolutionary Anti-Racist Action, actually carried out a number of bombings and sabotage campaigns against Shell, and were successful in winning that divestment, in forcing Shell to pull out of South Africa by causing them such immense amounts of damage, also in the context of many other tactics, including informational campaigns and boycotts and protests and all these other things. Working together had a very strong effect. Advocates of nonviolence, they frequently say that nonviolence works, and the principal examples that they use of that are Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King in the U.S. The problem with that is that this represents this constitutes a really great historical whitewashing, that in fact the resistance in India was incredibly diverse, and Gandhi was a very important figure within that resistance, but the resistance was by no means pacifist in its entirety, that there were a number of armed guerrilla groups, a number of militant struggles, very important riots and other strong clashes which were a part of the struggle for Indian independence. So on the one hand, Gandhi basically got negotiating power from the fact that there were other elements in the struggle which were even more threatening to British dominance. So the British specifically chose to dialogue with Gandhi because he was perhaps for them the least threatening of the important elements of resistance. And if those other elements had not existed, if those other elements had not existed, they simply could have ignored Gandhi.